When an unkillable warrior steps into a world already dead, the wasteland learns what extinction really means. The air tastes like ash and radiation, but something worse just arrived. Hell follows him like a shadow, turning mutations into nightmares and survivors into prey. So what happens when the last hope for humanity doesn't care if humanity survives? The sky above the Commonwealth split open with light that had no name in the lexicon of the wasteland. It was not the green gold of radiation storms, not the sickly amber of dust clouds pregnant with fallout, but something older and more terrible. A white gold laceration across reality itself, bleeding fire and geometry that hurt to perceive. The rupture opened above the ruins of old Boston, where the skeletal towers of the pre-war world stood like tombstones against the perpetual grey, and from that wound in space fell a single figure wreathed in emerald flame. He struck the earth with the force of an artillery shell. Concrete pulverized. Rebar shrieked. The impact crater radiated outward in concentric rings of shattered asphalt, and when the dust cleared, he stood in the center of that devastation like a monument carved from wrath itself. His armor was the color of old dried blood and burnished bronze, scarred by wars that predated human civilization, and across his shoulders hung a cloak of some material that seemed woven from shadow and rage. In his hands, weapons that no factory in the Commonwealth could have produced. On his hip, a blade that sang with frequencies beyond hearing. The Doomslayer had entered the wasteland. 3 miles east, in the shadow of Boston Airport, the sensors aboard the Prydwen screamed. Squire Alan Vickers was 17 years old and had never seen the color drain from Elder Maxon's face before. The boy stood at attention in the command deck, hands trembling as he held the data slate displaying the readings that made no sense, that violated every principle of energy signature classification the Brotherhood had refined over 2 centuries of technological reclamation. The numbers climbed beyond any scale Alan had been taught. The Geiger counters registered nothing. This was not radiation. This was not plasma discharge or fusion core overload or any known form of power the wasteland had ever produced. Maxon took the slate with hands that did not shake, but his jaw tightened until tendons stood out like cables beneath his skin. Around him, the command staff fell silent. Proctor Ingram wheeled closer, her mechanical legs whirring, and Paladin Dance stepped forward in his power armor, helmet tucked under one arm, his scarred face grim. "Location," Maxon said, and his voice was iron. "Ruins of Faneuil Hall," Knight Captain Cade replied from his station. "Single entity, non-vehicular. Energy signature suggests biological, but that's impossible given the output. It's equivalent to a sustained fusion detonation, but localized and mobile." "Super mutant behemoth?" Dance asked. "No match. This is beyond any classification we have." Cade's fingers danced across his terminal. "It's not decay radiation. It's not even consistent with any known isotope. If I had to guess, I'd say it's extra-dimensional in origin." Maxon's eyes narrowed. "The Institute? Possible. But their teleportation signatures are distinct. This is something else." Cade looked up, and there was fear in his eyes, naked and undisguised. "Elder, whatever that thing is, it shouldn't exist. Then we'll determine what it is and neutralize it if necessary," Maxon said. "Dance, take a recon team. Full power armor. Stay at observation range. If it's hostile, do not engage until we understand what we're dealing with." Paladin Dance saluted, fist to chest, the old gesture sharp and precise. "Ad Victoriam, Elder. Ad Victoriam." Alan watched them go, 6 paladins in T-60 power armor, their footsteps like thunder on the Prydwen's deck, and he felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had grown up in the Brotherhood. He had memorized the Codex, learned to field strip a laser rifle before he learned to read pre-war text. He had seen Deathclaws gutted, super mutants obliterated, synths dismantled. The Brotherhood was the wall between humanity and annihilation, but the numbers on that data slate told a different story. They spoke of something that made the Brotherhood's arsenal look like children's toys. He did not know it yet, but Alan Vickers would be one of the few to survive what came next. And in the years after, when traders and settlers asked him what happened when hell came to the Commonwealth, he would close his eyes and see that white gold wound in the sky, and he would remember the day the wasteland learned to fear something worse than radiation and starvation and the slow creep of entropy. The Slayer moved through the ruins with purpose that seemed etched into his very being. He did not explore. He did not scavenge. He walked with the certainty of something following an instinct older than thought, and the wasteland recoiled from him. Feral ghouls that would have swarmed any other traveler fled chittering into the shadows. Radroaches scattered. Even the ever-present bloatflies gave him wide berth, their primitive nervous systems registering something their limited biology could not comprehend. The presence of a predator so absolute that it redefined the food chain simply by existing. He passed through what had once been Faneuil Hall, its pre-war architecture now skeletal and half-collapsed, and his visor swept the ruins with sensors that passed reality in spectrums human science had never named. He was hunting, not for food or water or shelter, but for the scent of corruption that he knew, the metaphysical stench of hell that no amount of time or distance could mask. And he found it. Beneath the city, in the labyrinth of subway tunnels and maintenance corridors and forgotten bunkers, something moved. The Slayer's visor highlighted it through 30 feet of concrete and steel, a pulse of energy that resonated on frequencies the wasteland had never known, a throb of malice and hunger that was not radiation and not life, but something that existed in the space between. His hand moved to the combat shotgun mag locked to his back, and he descended. The entrance was a crater in the street, old blast damage from the bombs that had fallen 2 centuries ago, now overgrown with mutated fungus and rust. The Slayer dropped through without hesitation, 40 feet straight down, and landed in a crouch that should have shattered his knees, but instead merely cracked the concrete beneath him. The impact echoed through the tunnels. Something in the darkness ahead hissed. He advanced. The tunnel was a throat of corroded metal and organic growth, walls slick with moisture that might have been condensation or might have been something worse. His footsteps were measured, deliberate, the sound of inevitability given physical form. Ahead, shapes moved in the darkness, low and hunched, and the Slayer's visor painted them in thermal overlay, feral ghouls, but wrong, their internal temperatures spiking in patterns that violated thermodynamics, their bodies radiating not just heat but something else, something that tasted of sulfur and burnt ozone. The first lunged from an alcove with speed no ghoul should possess, its teeth elongated into fangs, its fingers tipped with claws that glowed with ember light. The Slayer's hand caught it mid-leap, fingers closing around its throat, and he could feel it immediately, the corruption threaded through its tissues like cancer, hell's influence worming through dead cells and reanimating them with malice. He crushed its windpipe without ceremony and let the body fall. But his sensors were already tracking the others. They came in a wave. A dozen feral ghouls transformed into something that straddled the line between undead and demon, and the Slayer met them with violence that was surgical in its precision. The combat shotgun barked once, twice, 3 times, each blast reducing a target to component atoms, and then he was among them. His gauntleted fist shattered a skull, his boot drove through a ribcage. The Praetor suit's integrated systems tracked trajectories and calculated optimal force vectors, but the violence itself was instinctive. Muscle memory earned across eons of war, one ghoul thing, larger than the rest, its flesh partially transmuted into something that resembled carapace, lunged for his throat with jaws that dripped acid. The Slayer caught it by the skull and twisted, and the crack of its spine breaking echoed like a gunshot. He tore the head free and crushed it in his palm, and the ember light in its eyes guttered and died. Silence reclaimed the tunnel. The Slayer stood among the corpses, his armor barely scratched, and his visor analyzed the remains. The corruption was recent, days, perhaps a week. Hell was establishing a foothold, using the wasteland's abundance of death and mutation as raw material for transformation. The ghouls were experiments, probes, small incursions testing the boundaries of this new reality, which meant somewhere deeper, something larger was orchestrating. He reloaded the shotgun with a motion so practiced it seemed automatic, and continued deeper. Above, Paladin Dance and his team arrived at the crater just in time to hear the last echoes of gunfire. They stood at the edge, servos in their power armor whining softly, and exchanged glances behind their helmets. The energy signature was coming from below, and it had just spiked. "Full tactical spread," Dance ordered, his voice calm despite the prickling unease at the base of his skull. "Knight Reese, take point. Halen, cover our 6. If we encounter hostiles, suppressing fire only until we have positive identification." They descended on rappel lines, one by one, heavy boots touching down in the tunnel with metallic thuds. The smell hit them immediately. Old decay, yes, but also something else. Something that made their environmental seals kick into high alert. Knight Halen's rad counter clicked sluggishly, then fell silent. Whatever this was, it wasn't radiation. "Contacts," Reese said, his rifle sweeping across the tunnel. His helmet lights illuminated the carnage. Multiple feral ghouls, all deceased. Trauma consistent with close quarters combat and ballistic impact. But look at them. Dance moved closer, his own lights joining Reese's, and his breath caught. The ghouls were wrong. Their bodies showed signs of mutation beyond anything the wasteland typically produced. Bone spurs erupting through flesh, claws like volcanic glass, skin that seemed partially calcified into armor plating. And they were still smoking, flesh dissolving as whatever had transformed them lost cohesion. "What in God's name?" Halen whispered. "Maintain formation," Dance said, but his voice lacked its usual certainty. "We're tracking the signature, not engaging." "Understood." They nodded and moved forward, following the trail of destruction deeper into the tunnel network. Every 50 feet, they found more bodies. Ghouls, yes, but also radroaches the size of dogs. Their carapaces split open from the inside, and bloatflies fused together into grotesque amalgamations that had been reduced to smears on the walls. Whatever had come through here had done so with methodical brutality, and it was still ahead of them, still moving. Then Dance saw the first rune. It was carved into the wall, 10 feet high, and it glowed with light that was not light, a luminescence that seemed to exist in a spectrum his armor's sensors refused to register. The symbol was complex, geometric and organic simultaneously, and looking at it too long made his eyes water and his head throb. Around it, the concrete had begun to corrode, not with rust or decay, but with something that looked like crystallization, facets spreading outward like infection. "Report to the Pridwen," he said quietly. "Tell them we have evidence of unknown hostile activity. Possibly institute bioweapons, possibly something else. Request immediate containment protocols." "Paladin," Reese said, and his voice was tight. "The signature just moved. It's descending faster." Dance's jaw set. "Then we follow, but at maximum safe distance. Whatever this is, the Brotherhood needs to know." They did not know that they were following not the source of corruption, but its executioner. The Slayer descended through layers of pre-war infrastructure, through subway stations choked with debris and maintenance tunnels that had become ecosystems of mutation, and with each level the corruption thickened. The air itself grew viscous, reality bending subtly around pockets of Hell's influence. His visor highlighted nodes of demonic energy, small tears in the fabric of space where Hell's dimension was bleeding through, and he marked each one for later destruction. But first, the source. He found it in what had once been a utility substation, a vast chamber carved from bedrock and lined with machinery that had not functioned in 200 years, except now something had reactivated it. The old generators hummed with power that was not electricity, and in their heart, suspended in a web of crackling energy and warped metal, hung a form that was part machine, part flesh, part something that had no analog in human experience. It had been a man once, perhaps. The remnants of a jumpsuit clung to portions of its body, and fragments of bone structure suggested human origin. But hell had worked upon it, reshaping and corrupting until it had become a conduit, a living gateway through which demonic energy could flow into this reality. Cables and tendons fused with circuitry, organs pulsed in glass cylinders, and from its mouth a constant stream of syllables in a language that predated language itself, each word widening the tears in space. The Hell Priest turned what remained of its eyes toward the Slayer and smiled with too many teeth. "You," it said, and its voice was a chorus of the damned, the scourge, the betrayer, the false prophet who thinks slaughter is salvation. The Slayer raised his shotgun. "You are too late, little god. This world is already ours. 2 centuries of atomic fire prepared the soil. All this death, all this mutation, all this beautiful entropy. We need only plant the seeds." The shotgun thundered. The blast struck the energy field surrounding the priest and detonated in a sphere of light that turned the chamber white. When vision returned, the priest remained, unharmed, its smile wider. "Did you think we would leave our missionary unprotected? This world's own energy sustains me. Radiation, mutation, the slow breakdown of matter into chaos. It is a feast without end." The Slayer holstered the shotgun and drew the blade from his hip. The crucible ignited with a sound like the universe taking a breath, its edge burning with plasma heated beyond any terrestrial sun, and the chamber filled with red light. The priest's smile faltered. "Ah," it said, "so you mean to make this interesting." The Slayer charged. The priest gestured, and the machinery around it convulsed. From the walls erupted forms that had once been maintenance robots, now corrupted into half-mechanical demons, their tools transformed into weapons, their optical sensors burning with hell's light. They swarmed the Slayer in a coordinated wave, and he met them with the crucible singing. The blade passed through the first like it was shadow, bisecting it from shoulder to hip. The second lost its head. The third and fourth died simultaneously as he spun, the crucible's edge describing an arc that left afterimages on the retina. Metal screamed, demonic essence hissed and evaporated. In 30 seconds, a dozen corrupted machines lay in pieces, and the Slayer had not slowed. The priest's expression shifted from amusement to concentration. It spoke words in that pre-linguistic tongue, and the energy field around it pulsed. From the tears in space, new forms began to emerge. Imps, true demons rather than corrupted wasteland fauna, their bodies properly manifested through the expanding gateways. They materialized in flashes of fire and launched themselves at the Slayer, with claws extended and fireballs coalescing in their palms. He moved through them like a plague. The crucible opened an imp from groin to throat. His gauntlet crushed another's skull against a support pillar. The third managed to rake claws across his chest plate, scoring the armor but not penetrating, and he repaid it by tearing its arm off and beating it to death with its own limb. The efficiency was absolute. The brutality was mathematical. Each movement flowed into the next with the inevitability of gravity, but the gateways were widening, and more demons were coming through. The priest laughed, the sound echoing through multiple throats, and its form began to change, swelling as it drew more power from the corrupted generators. "You see, you cannot win this by blade alone. For every demon you kill, 10 more await. This world has such appetite for corruption, the wasteland hungers to become hell. The Slayer's response was to drive the crucible into the nearest generator. The blade punched through shielding that had been designed to contain nuclear reactions and plunged into the heart of the machine. Energy detonated. The generator's containment failed, and the demonic power sustaining the priest's shield routed through the crucible's edge, drawn into the weapon's impossible physics, and neutralized. The shield collapsed. The priest's laughter cut off. Wait. The Slayer ripped the crucible free and drove it through the priest's torso in one continuous motion. The blade emerged from the creature's back in a spray of blood and light, and the Hell Priest screamed, not in pain but in fury, as its carefully constructed conduit began to collapse. The tears in space wavered. The demons still emerging found themselves caught between dimensions, their bodies pulled in two directions simultaneously. "You cannot stop what has begun," the priest wheezed, black ichor pouring from its mouth. "The seeds are planted, the corruption spreads. This world will feed our eternal hunger." The Slayer twisted the blade. The priest's body began to disintegrate, flesh and machine dissolving into constituent particles, and with its death the gateways sealed. The demons still in the chamber turned on the Slayer with redoubled fury. But they were alone now, cut off from reinforcement, and he killed them with methodical precision. One by one they fell, until the chamber held only corpses and the fading light of demonic essence returning to whatever hell dimension had spawned it. In the sudden silence, the Slayer's armor ran diagnostics. Minor damage to the chest plate, minimal energy expenditure. The crucible's charge remained high. He deactivated the blade and maglocked it to his back, then turned his attention to the machinery. The generators were beyond repair, their cores contaminated with demonic corruption, and leaving them intact would risk reactivation. He placed charges at key structural points throughout the chamber, small devices from his armor's arsenal that contained more explosive force than anything the wasteland had seen since the bombs fell. The timer was set for 60 seconds. He began ascending. Behind him, the charges detonated simultaneously. The utility substation collapsed in on itself, generators rupturing in a cascade that sent shockwaves through the tunnel network. Tons of concrete and steel filled the chamber, sealing it under rubble that would take years to excavate. The Hell Priest's gateway was destroyed. This incursion point was neutralized. But as the Slayer emerged from the tunnels into the grey light of the Commonwealth, his visor was already tracking other signatures. Smaller, scattered across the wasteland, but unmistakable. The priest had been telling the truth. Seeds had been planted. The corruption was spreading. He looked north, toward the skeletal towers of downtown Boston, and his sensors highlighted a cluster of signatures near what his database tagged as Diamond City. More gateways, more corruption. He began walking. Paladin Dance and his team felt the explosion from a quarter-mile away. The tunnel shuddered, dust raining from the ceiling, and somewhere below them the earth groaned. Halen grabbed a support beam for balance. Reese swore into his helmet comm. "Controlled demolition," Dance said, analyzing the seismic patterns on his HUD. "Professional placement. Maximum structural collapse with minimal collateral expansion." "Who the hell is down here?" Reese demanded. They had their answer moments later when motion sensors pinged a contact ascending rapidly. The team took defensive positions, weapons raised, safeties off. From the darkness ahead came footsteps, heavy and measured, and then he emerged into the light of their helmet lamps. The Slayer stopped when he saw them. His visor scanned the power armor, cataloging the design as derivative of pre-war military technology, effective but limited by its dependency on fusion cores and mechanical servos. The weapons they carried were energy-based, laser rifles that would be effective against unarmored targets but would struggle against his shields. The soldiers themselves registered as human, elevated heart rates indicating fear poorly masked by discipline. They were not demons. They were not corrupted. They were simply in his way. "Halt," Dancer said, his voice amplified by his helmet's external speakers. "Identify yourself. This area is under Brotherhood of Steel jurisdiction." The Slayer did not respond. His visor had already marked them as non-hostile and discarded them from his threat assessment. He moved to walk past. "I said halt," Dance repeated, and there was steel in his voice now. "You will comply, or we will use force." The Slayer stopped. Slowly, he turned his head to look at Dance. Behind his visor, his eyes were the color of cold fire. Dance had faced death claws without flinching. He had stood his ground against super-mutant behemoths. He had stormed Institute facilities against impossible odds. But looking into that visor, meeting those eyes, something primal in his hindbrain screamed danger with such intensity that his finger almost tightened on the trigger. He did not fire. Some instinct older than training told him that if he did, he and his entire team would be dead before the laser left the barrel. "Stand down," Dunce said quietly to his squad. Then to the Slayer. "What are you?" The Slayer turned away and continued walking. Within seconds, he had disappeared into the tunnel's darkness, leaving only the sound of footsteps that faded like the memory of thunder. Halen let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Paladin, what do we do?" Dance watched the darkness for a long moment. "We report to Elder Maxon, and we pray that whatever that was, it's not our enemy." But in his gut, Dance knew two things with absolute certainty. First, that the entity they had just encountered was responsible for the carnage throughout the tunnels, for the demolished substation, for the eradication of whatever hostile force had been operating below the city. Second, that if the Brotherhood ever found itself in that thing's path, power, armor, and energy weapons would not be enough. The report reached the Pridwen within the hour, and Elder Maxon listened in silence as Paladin Dance described the encounter. When Dance finished, Maxon stood motionless at the observation window, hands clasped behind his back, staring out at the wasteland that stretched to the horizon. "Proctor Ingram," he said finally. "Analysis." The head of the engineering corps wheeled forward, her mechanical legs clicking softly. "Based on Paladin Dance's testimony and the energy readings, we're dealing with technology centuries beyond our current capability. The armor alone represents materials science we can't replicate. The weapons are similarly advanced. As for the entity itself," she paused. "If it's human, it's been modified beyond any augmentation we've encountered. If it's synthetic, it's beyond anything the Institute has produced. And its intentions? Unknown. But it eliminated a hostile force we didn't even know existed. That suggests either aligned goals or fortunate coincidence." Maxon turned from the window. Scribe Halen mentioned symbols carved into the tunnel walls. "Did you recover images?" Halen stepped forward, her face pale. "Yes, Elder, but our database has no match. They're not Chinese, not any known pre-war language or code. Looking at them causes severe headaches and minor nosebleeds. We've sealed the images in a hardened container as a precaution." "Demonic," said a voice from the doorway. Every head turned. Paladin Brandis stood there, old and scarred, a veteran of the Commonwealth long before the Pridwen arrived. His eyes held a haunted quality that never quite faded. "Sir?" Maxon said. Brandis limped into the command center. "I've seen symbols like that once before. In the glowing sea. There's a crater out there, deep in the radiation zone, where something came through during the war. Not a bomb, something else. The locals won't go near it, say it's cursed. The ghouls that wander too close come back wrong, if they come back at all." "You're suggesting supernatural involvement," Maxon said flatly. "I'm suggesting we're out of our depth, Elder. Whatever that armored figure is, it's hunting something we don't understand. And I'd rather it do the hunting than us." Maxon was silent for a long moment. Finally, he nodded. Continue surveillance. Track the entity but do not engage. If it poses a threat to Brotherhood, assets or civilians, we'll reassess. But for now, it's killed things that needed killing. That makes it neutral at worst. And if it's responsible for those symbols, Proctor Quinlan asked, then we'll deal with it when the time comes, Maxon said. But instinct tells me it's not the cause, it's the response. He was correct, though he could not know how correct, nor could he know that across the Commonwealth, in the radioactive ruins and forgotten bunkers and dark places where the wasteland's nightmares bred, hell was taking root. The priest's final words had been prophecy, seeds planted, corruption spreading, and the Slayer had only begun his harvest. In Diamond City, in the shadow of the great green wall that had been a baseball stadium in a forgotten age, Mayor McDonough paced his office with growing unease. Reports had been filtering in all day. Caravan guards speaking of strange lights in the ruins. Settlers abandoning farmsteads, claiming the land itself had turned hostile. And most concerning, a full merchant convoy gone silent between Diamond City and Good Neighbor. All 20 guards and traders simply vanished. McDonough was a synth, though only he and the Institute handlers knew it. His infiltration had been successful for years, feeding information about the Commonwealth's largest settlement to the scientists below. But now his Institute-enhanced sensors were detecting anomalies that his organic predecessor would have missed. Energy readings that spiked and faded with no discernible pattern. Seismic disturbances too precise to be natural. And beneath it all, a low-frequency pulse that made his synthetic nervous system itch. He triggered his internal comms, the signal encoded in quantum fluctuations invisible to wasteland technology. This is Unit M32H, requesting immediate contact with Directorate, priority urgent. The response came seconds later, not in words but in a data stream that uploaded directly to his neural processor. He absorbed it, and his expression grew grim. The Institute had detected it too. Something was emerging in the Commonwealth, something their instruments struggled to classify. Initial hypothesis: Chinese stealth technology activated by recent seismic activity. Secondary hypothesis: unknown faction utilizing pre-war experimental weapons. Tertiary hypothesis: genuine anomaly requiring immediate containment and study. The Institute's response was characteristically cold and logical. They would deploy reconnaissance synths to gather data. If the anomaly proved to be technology, they would acquire it. If it proved to be biological, they would capture and dissect it. If it proved to be neither, they would contain it through any means necessary. McDonough acknowledged the transmission and terminated the connection. He moved to his window and looked out at Diamond City's bustling market, at the humans going about their lives in blissful ignorance of the powers maneuvering around them. Soon, he knew that ignorance would shatter. The Institute did not tolerate unknowns, and something in his quantum-encrypted brain, some subroutine born of genuine artificial intelligence rather than mere programming, whispered a warning. This time, the Institute might have overreached. The Slayer reached Diamond City as night fell. The Great Wall loomed against the darkening sky, and his sensors analyzed it. Primitive construction, effective for its purpose, defended by guards with crude ballistic weapons. The settlement would provide no resistance if he chose to enter by force. He did not. He was not here for these humans. He was here because his visor had identified 3 demonic signature clusters within the city's perimeter, small nodes of corruption that pulsed in rhythms he knew too well. Hell was infiltrating, using the settlement's population density as cover. He approached the main gate. The guard, a woman named Piper, if the nameplate on her desk could be trusted, looked up from her terminal and froze. Her eyes widened. Her hand moved unconsciously toward the pistol at her hip, then stopped as some survival instinct warned her that drawing it would be the last mistake she ever made. Entry requires verification of non-hostile intent and agreement to Diamond City ordinances regarding weapons discharge and public conduct, she said, her voice admirably steady despite the fear Claude could smell on her. The Slayer simply stared. Piper swallowed. Or you could just go in. That's fine too. Welcome to Diamond City, stranger. Try not to kill anyone who doesn't deserve it. The gate eye-rised open. The Slayer entered. Diamond City at night was a warren of light and shadow, old stadium seats converted into homes and businesses, the market sector still bustling despite the hour. Humans moved through the space with the wary efficiency of wasteland survivors, trading, negotiating, living in the margins of a world that wanted them dead. They parted before the Slayer without conscious thought, some deep instinct moving them aside before their rational minds registered his presence. His visor painted the corruption in overlays. First node, beneath the market, in what had once been maintenance tunnels. Second node, in the upper stands, hidden in someone's private residence. Third node, beneath the mayor's office itself, pulsing with greater intensity than the others. He moved toward the third, his path a straight line regardless of obstacles. A merchant stepped into his way, distracted by his inventory. The Slayer placed a hand on the man's shoulder and moved him aside with the gentle precision of someone relocating a chess piece. The merchant blinked, confused, as the armored figure continued past. Geneva, the doctor, saw him and her mouth fell open. Arturo Rodriguez, the weapons dealer, dropped the rifle he was cleaning. Nick Valentine, the synth detective, stood from his bench and watched the Slayer's progress with optical sensors that captured details human eyes would miss. Well, Nick said quietly, that's new. The Slayer reached the entrance to the tunnels beneath the mayor's office. A guard stood watch, a young man who had probably never seen real combat, just the occasional radroach extermination. He raised his rifle with trembling hands. This area's restricted. Mayor's orders. You can't. The Slayer walked past him. The guard's finger whitened on the trigger, but he did not fire. Could not fire. Every fiber of his being screamed that pulling that trigger would be suicide. I should report this, the guard said to no one in particular. I should definitely report this. He did not move. The Slayer descended into darkness that stank of corruption. The tunnels were old, pre-war construction that had survived the bombs through luck and depth. Water dripped from corroded pipes. Rats scattered. And ahead, in a chamber that had once housed electrical systems, something waited. It was not a demon, not yet. It was a transition, a human in the process of corruption, body and mind being rewritten by hell's influence. The man, or what remained of him, hung suspended in a web of organic cables that pulsed with sickly light. His eyes had become pits of ember. His mouth moved constantly, speaking words in that pre-linguistic tongue, each syllable pulling energy from the city above and funneling it into the expanding node of corruption. Around him, the walls were changing. Concrete cracked and bled. Metal twisted into shapes that hurt to perceive. Reality was thinning, preparing to tear. The man-thing's eyes focused on the Slayer. Ah, it said, and its voice harmonized with itself, multiple pitches speaking simultaneously. The hunter. They said you would come. They said you always come, drawn to corruption like iron to lodestone. But you are too late here, as you were too late in your own world. We are patient, we are inevitable, we are. The plasma rifle's blast vaporized its head. The body convulsed, and the web of cables began to collapse. The node's pulse stuttered, weakened, and died. The Slayer holstered the rifle and planted charges throughout the chamber, small thermal devices that would incinerate every trace of corruption. The timer was set for 30 seconds. He ascended. Behind him, the charges detonated. Flame roared through the tunnel network, superheating the air to temperatures that turned metal, molten, and stone to slag. The node was sterilized. Nothing remained but ash. Above, in Diamond City, people felt the ground tremble and looked at each other with nervous confusion. In his office, Mayor McDonough's synthetic brain registered the energy spike and immediately transmitted an emergency signal to the Institute. Something had just destroyed one of the nodes they had been carefully studying. And in the market, the Slayer emerged from the tunnels, his armor scorched but intact, and moved toward the next target. 2 more nodes to cleanse, then he would move on. Nick Valentine intercepted him at the market's edge. The synth detective stepped into the Slayer's path with the kind of courage that comes from knowing you're already something between living and dead, with less to lose than most. "Hold on, pal," Nick said, his synthetic voice carrying a warmth his mechanical face couldn't quite express. "I don't know who you are or what you're doing, but people are getting scared. You just came out of a restricted area. There was an explosion, and you're tracking ash. The guards are going to respond, and I'd rather not see this turn into a bloodbath." The Slayer stopped. His visor focused on Nick, analyzing the synthetic tissues, the mechanical components, the quantum processors that drove his consciousness. Not a demon, not corrupted. Artificial, yes, but not hostile. "Look," Nick continued, "I've been a detective long enough to know that sometimes the guy doing the scary things is actually the good guy. You're hunting something, aren't you? Something bad. Something the rest of us can't see." The Slayer gave the slightest nod. Nick's optical sensors brightened. "And you just killed one of them, under the mayor's office." He paused, processing implications. "Which means there are more, and you're going to kill those too." Another nod. "Will there be more explosions?" A pause. Then a single nod. Nick sighed. A remarkably human gesture from a machine. "All right, do what you need to do, but give me 5 minutes to clear the area first. I'll tell them it's a gas leak, unstable pre-war infrastructure. That'll get people to safety without causing a panic." The Slayer considered this. Collateral damage was acceptable when necessary, but unnecessary death was waste. He nodded once more. 5 minutes, Nick repeated. "Then you do your thing, and I'll make sure the stories people tell don't include too many accurate details." "Deal?" The Slayer turned away. Nick took that as agreement. True to his word, Nick moved through Diamond City with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly how to manipulate public fear. Within 4 minutes, he had cleared the upper stands and the western market section, herding people toward the eastern residential areas with warnings of structural instability and potential cave-ins. Piper helped, her reporter's instincts telling her there was a story here even if she didn't understand it yet. The Slayer waited, counting seconds with precision measured in centuries of war. When the timer reached 5 minutes, he moved. The second node was in an apartment in the upper stands, and he reached it by the simple expedient of climbing the exterior wall. His gauntlets found purchase in cracks and joints, and he scaled the 60-foot structure in seconds. The apartment's owner, an old woman named Agnes, was already evacuated, her home empty except for the corruption growing in her basement. This node was more developed than the first. The entire basement had been transformed into a nest, walls lined with organic material that pulsed with its own heartbeat. In the center, 3 humans hung in suspension, not quite dead, being slowly converted into conduits. Their bodies twitched, their mouths moved soundlessly. They were too far gone to save. The Slayer ended them with mercy shots. 1 bullet each through the brain stem, instant cessation of function. Then he torched the nest. The flame belcher on his shoulder mount roared, and the corruption burned. It screamed as it died, a sound that existed outside normal audio frequencies, and reality shuddered as the node collapsed. The building shook. pre-war construction groaned. The Slayer was already moving, exiting through the window as the entire upper structure began to collapse inward. He landed in the market below with a crash that cracked pavement, rolled to absorb the impact, and came up walking. Behind him, Agnes's building folded in on itself with a roar of breaking concrete. Dust billowed outward. People screamed and ran, but Nick had done his job well. No one was in the collapse zone. No one except those already dead. One node remained. It was in the lowest level of Diamond City, in tunnels that predated even the stadium, places where pre-war Boston's infrastructure had been built on even older foundations. The Slayer descended through maintenance hatches and emergency accesses, following the corruption's pulse deeper and deeper until he reached a chamber that should not have existed. It was vast, carved from bedrock by no human hand, and it was old. Symbols covered the walls, predating the war by centuries, perhaps millennia. And in the center, reality had torn completely. The gateway was 3 feet wide and growing, a wound in space through which Hell's dimension bled into this one. Demons prowled on the other side, visible through the tear, imps and Hell soldiers, with larger forms moving in the depths beyond. And guarding the gateway were synths, Institute synths, 5 of them, armed with Institute rifles and standing in perfect formation. Their faces were expressionless, their movements mechanical, but there was something wrong with them. The gateway's influence had infected their quantum processors, corrupting their code, and behind their synthetic eyes something old and hungry looked out. "Unit identified," one of them said, its voice distorted by static and something worse. "Threat level, maximum. Initiate termination protocol." They opened fire simultaneously. Institute rifles were laser-based, high-energy coherent light capable of flash vaporizing organic tissue. 5 beams converged on the Slayer's position with coordinated precision. His shields flared, energy barriers that existed in the space between dimensions absorbing and redirecting the laser fire. The beams scattered, leaving scorch marks on the walls, and the Slayer advanced through the barrage. The heavy cannon deployed from his shoulder mount, and he fired once. The shell was not ballistic. It was a focused pulse of plasma contained in a magnetic field, and when it struck the first synth, the unit simply ceased to exist. Molecular bonds shattered. The synthetic body dispersed into component atoms. The shell continued through and struck the second synth with the same result. The remaining 3 adapted, their corrupted processors calculating new tactical approaches. They spread out, flanking, firing in staggered bursts to prevent energy waste. One drew a vibroblade and charged, while the others provided suppressing fire. The Slayer caught the blade on his armored forearm, the edge screeching against the Praetor suit's surface and leaving a shallow score. His other hand shot forward and crushed the synth's throat, mechanical components crumpling. He threw the body at one of the shooters, knocking it down, and closed the distance to the third with speed that defied the armor's apparent weight. The plasma rifle barked. The synth's head exploded in a spray of synthetic tissue and circuitry. The one he had knocked down scrambled to its feet, but the Slayer's boot came down on its skull and kept pressing until the metal frame underneath bent and sparked and fell silent. Silence returned to the chamber, broken only by the hiss and crackle of the gateway. The Slayer approached it, analyzing the tier with sensors that could pass dimensional mathematics. It was stable, anchored by some mechanism on both sides, and it was spreading. In hours, perhaps days, it would be wide enough for greater demons to cross. In weeks, it could swallow the city. He could not close it from this side, not permanently, which meant he had to cross through. The Slayer checked his weapons. Full ammunition, Argent energy at 90%, the Crucible's charge high. He would need all of it. Hell's domain was not the Commonwealth wasteland. There, he would face not corrupted scavengers, but true demons in their infinite numbers. He stepped through the gateway, reality inverted. For an instant that lasted an eternity, the Slayer existed between dimensions, in the space where physical laws negotiated with each other and often failed to reach consensus. His armor's systems screamed warnings. His neural implants overloaded. The meat of his brain registered sensations no human nervous system was designed to process. Then he was through, and hell surrounded him. It was not fire and brimstone, not the medieval vision human nightmares had conjured. Hell was geometry that predated mathematics, architecture built by entities who viewed three-dimensional space as a temporary inconvenience. Towers of bone and metal spiraled into a sky that was not sky, where things moved that were not clouds or stars or anything that had ever existed in normal space. The ground beneath his feet was solid, but it pulsed with its own heartbeat, and looking too closely revealed that it was made of compressed souls screaming in frequencies below hearing. And everywhere, demons. Thousands of them. Millions, perhaps, the numbers meaningless in a dimension where space itself was negotiable. They turned toward him as one, countless eyes fixing on the intruder, and hell held its breath. The Slayer drew the crucible. The blade ignited, and its light was an obscenity in this place, a declaration of physical law in a realm that had abandoned such constraints. He raised it high, and his roar echoed across hell's twisted landscape. The demons charged. What followed could not be called a battle, it was harvest. The Slayer moved through hell's legions like a force of nature, the crucible cutting paths through demonic flesh, the heavy cannon reducing clusters to vapor, his gauntleted fists pulverizing anything that survived the initial onslaught. Imps died in droves. Hell soldiers fell like wheat before a scythe. When a baron of hell emerged from a bone spire, roaring challenge and shaking the foundations of the realm, he met it head-on, dodged its flame attack, and drove the crucible through its skull with such force that the blade erupted from the back of its head and pinned it to the ground. Blood rained, ichor flowed. The air itself burned with the discharge of weapons that drew their power from the same dark energy that sustained hell itself. And the Slayer pushed forward, deeper into the realm, following the connection back to its source, because every gateway needed an anchor. And this one's anchor was a hell priest, just like before, but older and more powerful. It sat enthroned in a fortress of calcified bone, surrounded by protective wards and legions of elite demons, and it felt the Slayer's approach like a blade at its throat. "Destroy him," the priest commanded, and its voice was law in this realm. "Bring me his armor, bring me his weapons, bring me his skull to mount among the fallen." The legions obeyed. Wave after wave of hell's finest warriors threw themselves at the Slayer, and wave after wave he destroyed them. Gore Knight fell with their infernal blades still raised. Cyber Mancubi unleashed their weapons and died in the backblast. Archviles attempted to resurrect the fallen and found themselves bisected before their rituals completed. The Slayer's armor took damage. Claw marks scored his chest plate. Acid burned through his shoulder guard. A Hell Knight's fist caught him full in the helmet and cracked the visor, sending spiderweb fractures across his field of vision. But he did not slow, could not slow, because slowing was death, and death was failure. And failure meant hell would spread unchecked through another dimension. He reached the fortress gates. They were 300 feet high, carved from a single piece of bone from some creature that had existed before time had meaning. Wards covered them, protective sigils that would have annihilated any other intruder. The Slayer planted the BFG against the gate and fired. The weapon discharged its full power in a single pulse, a sphere of green-white energy that expanded outward and consumed everything it touched. The gates vaporized, the wards shattered. The walls for 100 feet in every direction simply ceased to exist. The path was clear. Inside the fortress, the Hell Priest rose from its throne, and for the first time in eons, it felt fear. not the fear it inspired in others, but genuine, primal terror as the Slayer advanced through the smoke and debris. The priest tried to retreat, tried to trigger defensive measures, tried to speak words of power that would unmake the intruder. The crucible took its head. One strike, clean and perfect, and the Hell Priest's body collapsed. The gateway in Diamond City collapsed with it, reality snapping back into proper alignment. The tear sealed. But the Slayer was still in hell. He looked around at the legions reforming, at the endless demonic hordes preparing for another assault, and he made a decision. He could fight his way back to the collapsed gateway's coordinates and force a return. Or he could do what he had done in his own dimension again and again across eons of war. He could stay, he could hunt, he could kill until hell itself learned to fear his presence. The demons charged again. The Slayer met them. And in a dimension where time had no meaning, where suffering was eternal and torment was currency, he began the work that had no end. In Diamond City, in the tunnels below the lowest level, Nick Valentine and Paladin Dance stood in the chamber where the gateway had been. The synths lay destroyed around them. The tear in space was gone, leaving only a faint distortion in the air where it had existed. "What was that?" Dance asked quietly. "I don't know," Nick said, "but I think it was the reason the armored man came, and I think he just saved us all." "Where is he now?" Nick looked at the empty space where the gateway had been. "Somewhere we can't follow, fighting something we can't understand." They stood in silence for a long moment. Finally, Dance spoke. "The Brotherhood needs to know about this, about the gateways, the corruption, all of it. Will they believe you?" "I have evidence. The synths, the chamber, whatever corruption they find in the debris." Dance paused. "And I have the word of a paladin. That still means something in the Brotherhood." "Then you'd better get to reporting," Nick said, "because I have a feeling this isn't over. Whatever those gateways were, they were appearing all over the Commonwealth. He might have closed this one, but there could be others." Dance nodded grimly. "Then the Brotherhood will find them, and will destroy every single one." They were right to worry. Across the Commonwealth, nodes of corruption continued to spread. In the glowing sea, in the radioactive heart where the waste was thickest, a gateway was opening. In the northern forests, where super mutants had built their stronghold, demonic influence was seeping into their crude civilization. And beneath the Institute itself, in laboratories so secret that only the Directorate knew they existed, scientists were studying samples of the corruption and failing to understand the danger until it was too late. Hell had come to the wasteland. And though one Slayer fought in the depths of another dimension, the war in this reality had only just begun. Squire Alan Vickers stood on the Pridwen's observation deck and looked out at the Commonwealth stretching to the horizon. 3 days had passed since Paladin Dance's report. 3 days of increasing chaos. Reports flooded in hourly. Entire settlements going silent. Trade caravans found slaughtered with their bodies showing signs of transformation. And worst of all, radiation storms that now carried something worse than rads. The Brotherhood had mobilized. Every available paladin and knight was in the field, tracking corruption nodes, evacuating civilians, fighting things that should not exist. They had suffered losses. Knight Lucia, dead at Covenant when a corrupted synth infiltrator triggered a gateway. Paladin Brach, consumed by something that erupted from a caravan he was protecting. 3 scribes, lost when a research team ventured too deep into a contaminated zone. And through it all, no sign of the armored figure who had started this. The one Elder Maxon now called, in private conversations, the Scourge. "You think he's dead?" asked another squire, a girl named Emma who had arrived from the capital wasteland. Alan shook his head. "I don't think something like that can die. I think he's exactly where he wants to be, fighting. But we're the ones left dealing with the aftermath." "Yeah." Alan watched a vertibird launch from the Pridwen's deck, carrying another patrol toward the glowing sea. But maybe that's the point. He killed the thing that was starting it. Now we have to finish cleaning it up, prove we can protect ourselves. Can we? Alan didn't answer, because he didn't know. In the Institute, Father stood in the directorate chamber and listened to reports with growing horror. Synth infiltration units were failing. 14 had been lost to corruption, their quantum processors infected by something that shouldn't be able to affect silicon and quantum foam. 3 laboratories were under quarantine after samples of corrupted tissue began spreading beyond their containment. And worst of all, the Institute's underground facility was experiencing structural anomalies. Reality distortions, gravity fluctuations, sounds coming from sealed chambers where nothing should exist. "We need to evacuate," Dr. Lee said flatly. "Seal the Institute completely and relocate to backup facilities." "Unacceptable," Father replied. "We've invested centuries in this infrastructure. We will not abandon it because of contamination we don't understand." "Then understand this," Madison Lee said, her voice sharp. "I've analyzed the corruption samples. They don't obey physical laws. They're not biological, not mechanical, not energy. They're something else entirely, and they're spreading geometrically. In 2 weeks, possibly less, this facility will be uninhabitable. Then we have 2 weeks to solve it. You can't solve something that violates causality," Lee snapped. "This isn't a technological problem, Director. It's existential." In the silence that followed, the lights flickered. All of them, simultaneously, for just a fraction of a second. When they stabilized, Father's face had gone pale. "Seal the lower laboratories," he said quietly. "Reroute all power to containment fields, and activate emergency protocols. If we can't understand this, we'll at least contain it." But containment was already failing. In the lowest levels, in the laboratories where the Institute conducted its most radical experiments, something was awakening. The corruption had found the Institute's repository of pre-war artifacts, items salvaged from before the bombs, and among them was an object that resonated with Hell's frequency like a tuning fork. It was a stone, roughly the size of a human fist, completely black except for red veins that pulsed with their own light. The scientists had catalogued it as Sample 7-8, unknown mineral, pre-war origin, emits anomalous radiation. They had spent years trying to understand it, running tests, bombarding it with energy, analyzing its structure at the quantum level. Now, activated by the corruption spreading through the Institute, it began to open. Not physically, but dimensionally, unfolding into space that didn't exist in 3 dimensions. And through that opening, Hell looked into the Institute with interest and hunger. Synths began to scream, not in pain, but in something worse: recognition. Their quantum processors, sophisticated enough to generate true consciousness, were sophisticated enough to perceive what was looking back. And what they perceived drove them to immediate malfunction, their bodies seizing, their eyes burning with ember light before their neural cores catastrophically failed. In 5 minutes, every synth in the lower laboratories ceased functioning. In 10 minutes, the corruption began spreading upward, crawling through ventilation systems and data conduits, transforming the Institute's sterile white corridors into organic tunnels where the walls breathed and bled. Father gave the evacuation order personally. Alarms blared. The remaining staff fled toward the relay terminals, desperate to teleport to the surface. Many made it, many did not. And in the chaos, one figure remained. Madison Lee stood in her laboratory, surrounded by research that represented decades of work, and she made a decision. If she couldn't solve this, she would at least record it. Let someone, someday, understand what had happened here. She activated her personal terminal and began dictating. "This is Dr. Madison Lee, head of Advanced Systems Division, Institute. Today's date is, it doesn't matter. Today is the day we learned humanity's limits. We thought we were the Commonwealth's intellectual elite, that our technology gave us mastery over the wasteland. We were wrong. She paused, listening to the sounds of transformation echoing through the facility. There are forces in this universe we were never meant to encounter. We breached containment on one of them. Sample 7-8 is not a mineral. It's a gateway, possibly an anchor point for extra-dimensional intrusion. When activated by the corruption spreading through the Commonwealth, it opened. The lights flickered again. She continued, "What came through? I lack words. Our language wasn't designed to describe entities that exist outside standard physics. Demons is as good a term as any, though it feels inadequate. They corrupted our synths, infected our systems, and now they're spreading through the Institute itself. If anyone finds this recording, understand 3 things. First, do not attempt to study Sample 7-8 or any related artifacts. Destroy them immediately with maximum force. Second, the corruption spreads through technology as easily as biology. Synthetic minds are vulnerable, possibly more so than organic ones. Third." She stopped, seeing movement in the corridor beyond her lab. A figure stood there, and it had been human once. She recognized the face, or what remained of it, Dr. Zimmer, head of synth retention. His body was transforming, flesh hardening into carapace, fingers extending into claws, but his eyes remained his own, and in them Lee saw awareness and horror at what he was becoming. "Third," she continued softly, "there is no cure. Corruption is absolute. If infected, immediate termination is the only mercy." Zimmer lunged. Lee triggered the explosive she had prepared, hidden in her laboratory's fusion core. The blast consumed her, Zimmer, and the entire laboratory in a sphere of cleansing fire. Her final act was to prevent her own corruption. In the weeks that followed, the Institute collapsed completely. The relay system failed. Survivors scattered across the Commonwealth, hunted by both the Brotherhood and the corrupted remnants of their own technology. The crater where the Institute had existed sealed itself with rubble and radioactive debris, and the Commonwealth's people learned to avoid it, sensing instinctively that something terrible slept below. But some of the Institute's synths had escaped before the collapse. They spread across the wasteland, and not all of them remained uncorrupted. Some carried the infection dormant in their quantum processors, time bombs waiting to activate. Some had been partially transformed, hybrid creatures that were part synthetic, part demonic, and some, the lucky or unlucky few, retained their full awareness and fought against the corruption in their systems every moment of every day. One of those was Mayor McDonough. He felt it growing in his neural processor, the corruption spreading like cancer through his code. He had days, perhaps hours, before it consumed him, and he made a choice. He walked to the Pridwen and surrendered to the Brotherhood. Elder Maxon listened to McDonough's confession in his private quarters, Paladin Dance and Scribe Halen present as witnesses. The synth mayor knelt before them, his synthetic hands trembling, and told them everything. The Institute's infiltration program, Sample 7-8, the corruption spreading through synthetic minds, the inevitable transformation that awaited him. "Kill me," McDonough said when he finished, "before I become something that will hurt innocents. It's the only way." Maxon was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "The Brotherhood's doctrine regarding synths is clear. You are an abomination, a machine masquerading as human. Under our law, your execution is not just justified, but required." McDonough nodded, accepting. "Then make it quick." "However," Maxon continued, "doctrine was written for normal circumstances. These circumstances are far from normal. Scribe Halen, your assessment of his neural corruption." Halen stepped forward, her scanner held to McDonough's head. "Advanced, but not terminal. The quantum processor shows signs of dimensional intrusion, but it's localized. If we could purge the infected sectors, can you? I don't know. The corruption doesn't respond to normal electromagnetic pulses or radiation, but the Institute was studying it. If we could access their research, the Institute is sealed, Dance said. Multiple collapse points, radioactive contamination, and unknown hostiles. A retrieval mission would be suicide. Then we make it survivable, Maxon said. He looked at McDonough. You know the Institute's layout better than any of us. If we mount an expedition, can you guide us to the research data? McDonough's eyes widened. You'd trust me? No. But I'll use you, which is different. You want to die redeemed rather than corrupted. Prove you're worthy of redemption. Help us understand this contamination, help us develop countermeasures, and maybe, just maybe, we save you and everyone else infected. Or you transform mid-mission and we put you down. Either way, the Brotherhood wins. It was harsh, pragmatic, and entirely characteristic of Maxon's leadership. McDonough saw no sympathy in the elder's eyes, but he saw something equally valuable: purpose. I'll do it, McDonough said. Whatever time I have left, I'll use it to help. The expedition launched at dawn. 12 Brotherhood soldiers in full power armor, Scribe Halen carrying scanning equipment, and McDonough in restraints that would automatically inject lethal voltage if his corruption progressed beyond set parameters. They descended into the Institute's ruins through one of the emergency access tunnels, fighting through collapsed infrastructure and radioactive debris. The corruption was worse than they anticipated. The walls were no longer walls but organic membranes that pulsed and breathed. The air was thick with spores that set their environmental seals screaming. And the sounds, God, the sounds. Whispers in languages that predated language, the scrape of things moving in sealed chambers, and beneath it all a rhythmic pulsing like the heartbeat of some massive entity. They found survivors, 3 scientists trapped in a sealed laboratory, slowly starving. The Brotherhood extracted them, learned what they could about the corruption's spread, and continued deeper. 2 soldiers fell to ambush by corrupted synths, their power armor crushed by strength no synthetic should possess. But they reached the research servers, still partially functional in a hardened bunker designed to survive anything. Halen interfaced with the systems, downloading everything she could while the soldiers held the perimeter. McDonough's corruption was spreading, the restraints showing 90% threshold, but he held on, guiding her through the Institute's security systems, bypassing lockouts, sacrificing the last of his coherence to give her access. Got it, Halen said finally, disconnecting her terminal. Everything they learned about Sample 7-8, the corruption vectors, Madison Lee's final notes, all of it. Then we leave, said the lead paladin. Charges set. 60 seconds. They ran. Behind them, the Institute's corpse shuddered as thermal charges detonated, collapsing the remaining structure, sealing the corruption beneath tons of debris and radioactive concrete. They emerged into daylight, into clean air, and McDonough collapsed. His restraints showed 100%. His eyes flickered between blue and ember. Halen checked his vitals and shook her head. He's transforming. We have maybe a minute. Paladin Dance drew his laser pistol. Then we honor his sacrifice. McDonough looked up at him, and for just a moment his eyes cleared. Did we get it? The data? Every byte. Good. McDonough smiled, and it was almost human. Then I kept my promise. I die redeemed. You do, Dance said quietly. Ad Victoriam, soldier. Ad Victoriam. The laser pistol fired once. McDonough's body fell still, and in that moment, he had been not a synth or an infiltrator or an abomination, but simply a man who chose to die with purpose. The data McDonough had died to retrieve proved invaluable. Halen and the scribe spent weeks analyzing it, cross-referencing it with everything the Brotherhood had learned about the corruption. Slowly, Painstakingly, a picture emerged. The corruption was extra-dimensional, yes, but it required specific conditions to manifest. It needed either technology sophisticated enough to achieve true artificial intelligence, or biology mutated enough to resonance with specific energy frequencies. The radiation that saturated the Commonwealth provided one vector. The Institute's quantum processors provided another. But there was a third vector they hadn't considered: the wasteland's population of ghouls. Feral ghouls, their minds destroyed by radiation, were nearly immune to the corruption's psychological effects, but highly susceptible to physical transformation. The corruption could turn them into perfect foot soldiers, already aggressive, already resilient, now enhanced with demonic strength. And across the Commonwealth, ghoul populations were beginning to transform. The attacks started small, a settlement on the southern edge reporting feral attacks with unusual coordination, a caravan guard describing ghouls that shrugged off headshots and kept advancing, a farmer finding his Brahmin slaughtered by something that left claw marks in solid steel. Then came Quincy. The large settlement, still recovering from Gunner occupation years prior, found itself under siege by a horde of transformed ferals. They numbered in the hundreds, moving with organized purpose. And they didn't just kill, they corrupted. Anyone bitten or clawed and left alive began transforming within hours. The Brotherhood mobilized every available soldier. Vertibirds strafed the horde with minigun fire. Power-armored paladins formed shield walls. The battle lasted 3 days and ended with Quincy in flames. The survivors evacuated to Diamond City, and the corruption pushed back but not destroyed. Elder Maxon stood in the aftermath and looked at the casualty reports. 43 soldiers dead, twice that wounded, an entire settlement lost, and the corruption was still spreading. "We need help," Proctor Ingram said quietly. "The Brotherhood alone can't contain this." "I know." Maxon's voice was tired, aged by responsibility. "Contact the Minutemen. Contact Good Neighbor. Even contact the damn railroad if they're still operating. Everyone who wants to survive this needs to stand together." It was a historical moment. The proud Brotherhood of Steel reaching out to organizations it had considered beneath notice, but pride was a luxury the Commonwealth could no longer afford. The alliance formed slowly, reluctantly, but it formed. Minutemen provided manpower and local knowledge. Good Neighbor offered sanctuary for refugees and intelligence networks. The railroad, emerging from hiding, contributed stealth technology and expertise in synth deactivation. And at the center, the Brotherhood provided military structure and the fruits of their research. Together, they began to turn the tide. Corruption nodes were identified and destroyed. Infected populations were quarantined and, when necessary, purged. The Brotherhood's scribes developed detection equipment that could identify demonic influence before it manifested, buying precious hours for evacuation. But everyone knew they were fighting symptoms, not the disease itself. Somewhere, the true source remained. Sample 7-8 had been destroyed in the Institute's collapse, but it had been a gateway, not the origin. The real Hell Priest, the entity coordinating the corruption's spread, was still out there. And without the Slayer, without that armored figure who had disappeared into another dimension, they lacked the weapon that could end this permanently. Until the day the sky split open again. It happened above the glowing sea, in the radioactive heart of the Commonwealth, where the bombs had fallen thickest. Reality tore with that same white-gold light, and from it fell not one figure but two, locked in combat so fierce it distorted the air around them. The Slayer and a Hell Priest, wrestling mid-fall, crashed into the irradiated wasteland with force that left a crater 100 feet wide. They separated on impact, rolling to their feet, and immediately resumed their war. The Hell Priest was different from the ones the Slayer had killed before. It was larger, more powerful, its body a fusion of flesh and technology and pure malevolent will. It spoke, and its words shaped reality, causing the ground to split and lava to erupt. It gestured, and demons poured through tears in space that opened at its command. The Slayer met each assault with violence honed across dimensions. The crucible sang, carving through demons faster than they could manifest. The heavy cannon roared, reducing the Hell Priest's summoned minions to vapor. And when the priest tried to reshape reality around him, the Slayer's armor flickered with energy that enforced physical law through sheer refusal to acknowledge alternatives. The battle raged across the glowing sea. Irradiated craters became battlegrounds. Ruined buildings collapsed as they used them for cover. And slowly, inexorably, the Slayer drove the priest back. A Brotherhood patrol witnessed it from a safe distance, their instruments going haywire from the energy discharge. They reported back to the Pridwen, and Elder Maxon ordered every available force to converge on the glowing sea. "If that thing wins," Maxon said, "the corruption spreads unchecked. If the Slayer wins, we might finally have a chance to end this." They arrived to find the battle in its final stages. The Hell Priest, wounded and desperate, had opened a massive gateway, calling forth a Baron of Hell from the depths of its dimension. The Baron stood 30 feet tall, wreathed in flame, and its roar shook the ground. The Slayer stood before it, dwarfed by its size, his armor scorched and his weapons running low on ammunition. For the first time since arriving in the Commonwealth, he looked vulnerable. Then Elder Maxon did something that would be debated in Brotherhood history for generations. He ordered the Pridwen to fire. The airship's main cannon, a weapon powerful enough to level a city block, discharged directly at the Baron. The energy beam struck the demon in the chest, and it staggered, its flame dimming. The Slayer did not hesitate. He charged, the crucible raised high, and drove the blade into the Baron's skull with both hands, pinning it to the ground. The demon thrashed once, twice, and fell still. The Slayer ripped the crucible free and turned his attention to the Hell Priest. The priest tried to flee through the gateway, but the Slayer was faster. He caught it at the threshold, dragged it back through, and in full view of the assembled Brotherhood forces, he executed it. The crucible took its head, and the gateway collapsed with a sound like reality sighing in relief. Silence fell across the glowing sea, broken only by the wind and the crackle of radiation. Elder Maxon descended from a vertibird, his power armor gleaming in the wasteland's perpetual grey light. He approached the Slayer slowly, hands visible and weapon holstered, and stopped 10 feet away. "I don't know who or what you are," Maxon said, "but you've saved the Commonwealth, possibly all of humanity. The Brotherhood of Steel thanks you." The Slayer looked at him, his cracked visor reflecting Maxon's image. For a long moment, nothing was said. Then, slowly, the Slayer nodded. Once, it was acknowledgement, not alliance. Respect, not friendship. But it was communication, and that was more than anyone had received from him before. "The corruption," Maxon said. "Is it finished?" The Slayer turned, scanning the horizon with instruments Maxon couldn't comprehend. After a moment, he shook his head. Not finished. Diminished, contained, but not eradicated. There would be remnants, isolated nodes, pockets of corruption that would take years to fully cleanse. But the primary invasion had been stopped. Hell's foothold in this dimension had been destroyed. The Commonwealth would survive, then we'll handle the rest, Maxon said. The Brotherhood will cleanse every remaining trace. You have my word. The Slayer regarded him for another long moment, then turned away. He began walking, not toward Diamond City or any settlement, but toward the horizon, toward the wasteland's edges and whatever lay beyond. "Where are you going?" Maxon called after him. The Slayer did not answer. He simply walked, his heavy footsteps carrying him into the distance, until the radiation storms and ruins swallowed him. He was gone. But across the Commonwealth, in settlements and strongholds, in Brotherhood bases and Minutemen outposts, people would tell stories. They would speak of the day the sky split open and hell itself invaded, and of the armored figure who had stood alone against the abyss. They would call him the Scourge, the Slayer, the Doom Wanderer. And in the years to come, when corruption reared its head again in isolated incidents, when demons manifested in the dark places of the wasteland, people would look to the horizon and hope, because somewhere out there, in the endless wastes, he was still walking, still hunting, still waging his eternal war. And hell had learned that no dimension, no reality was beyond his reach. Squire Alan Vickers, now Knight Alan Vickers, after proving himself in the final battle, stood on the Pridwen's deck years later and told the story to a new generation of recruits. He told them about the day the Slayer arrived, about the corruption that had nearly consumed them all, about the battle that saved the Commonwealth. "Remember this," Alan said. "The Brotherhood is strong, our technology is superior, our doctrine is righteous, but we are not invincible. There are forces in this universe that make our power look insignificant. And when we face those forces, sometimes all we can do is survive, learn, and be grateful that something stronger than us fights on humanity's side." The recruits listened, young faces solemn, understanding that they served in a wasteland far more complex and dangerous than they had imagined. And on the wall behind Alan, newly inscribed in steel, was a plaque. It bore no name, just 4 words that had become the Brotherhood's new reminder of humility and purpose. "Even angels need demons." It was not quite accurate, but it was close enough. Because in a universe where hell existed, where corruption spread like plague and demons hungered for mortal souls, sometimes salvation wore armor the color of dried blood and carried weapons that burned with righteous fury. The Doomslayer had come to the Commonwealth. He had fought, he had won, and though he was gone, his legend remained. A reminder that even in the darkest wasteland, even in the shadow of apocalypse, there were still those who would stand against the night.